Welcome to the Education Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsor, Limmer Education, we can make science more accessible and understandable. Welcome everyone to a special session of the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum, Education Research Journal Club. We are here live in Louisville, Kentucky, and we are broadcasting to you from the Accreditcon conference, the conference of the CAAHEP. So we're really excited to be doing this, and we have some special guests for us today. I just want to remind you first that the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum is dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of pre-hospital research. Remember, we believe that it is the responsibility of EMS professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to support pre-hospital emergency care. And here in our Education Research Journal Club, we take a closer look at some of the latest science in medical education. So we want to first thank our sponsor, Limmer Education. It's through their generous support that we're able to make this science more accessible and understandable. So I'm Megan Corey, and I am here with David Page live. Isn't it so nice to be in person?
Wow,
Yay!
so cool.
We're going to be reviewing the article entitled Administrative and Educational Characteristics of Paramedic Programs in the United States, and this was published in Pre-Hospital and Disaster Medicine in April 2022. We do want to take a moment to acknowledge one of the study co-authors, and that's Doug York. Mr. Doug York died earlier this year, and he was just a wonderful person, a technical advisor at the COA EMSP board member, and we all remember him, and he happened to be one of the study co-authors on this. Joining us today is Michael Miller, Assistant Director of the COA EMSP, and he is a former program director, so he's going to help us discuss this research that comes out of the annual report. So first, if you're joining us live, remember that you can use the chat to post some comments, but use the Q&A if you have questions. So if you have questions for the panelists as we go and we pour through this research, make sure to post those in the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring those on our multiple areas here. So if you hear something you like, please quote or tag or share it on your favorite social media site. Please use hashtag EMS Research, and we love it, of course, when you tag us at PCRF at UCLA, as well as our sponsors. All right, so let's dig in. But actually, I think I'm wrong. Let me advance this because we do have one thing to announce as well. And yes. Dave, I think I'm going to have you announce
Well,
this.
June 30th is the deadline for our abstracts for this year for the International Scientific Symposium at EMS World Expo.
Oops, I'm sorry.
This will be in Orlando. And if you have research, got some research, we want your research in Orlando. Please note that those of you thinking of submitting to NEMSP this year can actually submit to both because of the proximity of the two conferences. So June 30th is our deadline, and we want to see your research. Please turn it in.
How about education research? Is that fair game too?
Yes, it is co-located this year. We have both clinical research and educational research, and so it's very exciting. Lots of really cool stuff, and you can be part of it. Please submit your research. June 30th.
Now remember, we're program directors, so we collect lots of data, and through the accreditation process, through our own college or school processes, program processes. So we've got, interesting stuff to kind of compile and report, and especially if you have maybe some over the time period that we were, adjusting through COVID. Great information to share. So remember, you've got a couple weeks left, so you can do it, get that abstract in. But let's turn now to the article of interest, which is Administrative and Educational Characteristics of Paramedic Programs in the United States. So we always say, and remember, we do a little bit of research teaching on this. Why do we need to know this? Why do we care about administrative and educational characteristics?
This is a big one. We've been waiting for years for this paper to come out. Why? Because yearly paramedic program directors fill out an annual report that tells us a little bit about what's going on in their paramedic programs. Now, this seems like an onerous kind of task that just seems maybe just administrative, but this is one of the benefits of accreditation, is a national view of what's happening in EMS education, particularly paramedic education. And this is the first time we've seen a compilation published in a peer-reviewed journal that tells us a snapshot of what's happening with paramedic programs all over the country. 677 of them actually, and 100% response rate, because really it's mandatory.
Yes.
So there was no choice about whether you're going to fill it out or not. And so kudos to the COAAHEP, Mike, in its representation here today, that allowed these researchers, I should say, not us, but we get the benefit of what these researchers did, in looking inside these annual reports and seeing what they tell us. So a descriptive study that I've never seen before data about the paramedic programs in the United States. And that, I think, I've been anxiously awaiting this from the day that the COA board said we should establish a research committee and we should be able to, sponsor research and help do research. So kudos that this made it to the light of day.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Dave. And
Mike, can you take a minute first?
There's more to come.
Good.
There's more to come.
Can you take a minute and just introduce yourself?
Yeah.
I gave you a brief one, but.
Yeah, no problem. Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Miller. I'm the Assistant Director of Accreditation Services for COA EMSP. I do want to note I've been in the position for all of 10 months. And so much of the work for this
expert already. I mean,
well, I don't know about that, but much of the work in this particular paper predates me. So I'm really excited to see the colleagues here, Doug York and Lisa Collard from our team that were instrumental in pulling this information together and helping the authors and the researchers in this particular project. So there's more of this information to come, and we will be excited to continue to work on those projects and share that information with folks.
I can't wait. I can't wait.
So one of the things that we've been talking about for the past couple of months on this webinar is the use of data sets. So a couple of months ago, we interviewed a dean, Justin Tilgman from Lenore Community College, and he's got three of his, actually three folks from the paramedic program are here at the conference. And Justin, we talked about some of his research, and we talked about the data set that he used. He contacted the COA and asked about using some of the data for research. So this is another data set. We've been talking about data sets. The National Registry was another one. Several months ago, we looked at a piece of research, and Jonathan Powell and Dr. Panchal joined us, and we talked about using data sets from the National Registry. So you have access to other data sets if you want to do research and ask questions of them, and this is one of them.
And thank you to Randy Hardick. He's online saying, hey, I couldn't come to Accreditcon because I'm in a no-fly state. And so sorry you've been grounded, but I'm glad that you could join us at least virtually. And there's, I don't know how many people here, maybe 1,000 people or so.
It's right around 500.
500. Oh, I just doubled you. Hey,
we're looking forward to that 1,000 mark here in a couple of years.
Wow. So okay, good. But if you were unable to come, we're sorry that you're not seeing this. It's just a lot of Old Home Week people being able to hug each other and love each other up in person, because it's like great to see familiar faces and get on with the work that we do. So
and
awesome.
the networking, it's so powerful. And if you are a program director out there and maybe you're new, this is actually a great place to meet others and network directly. And don't forget that we can do that electronically too. You can always email one of us at the PCRF as well. If you have research questions or you need some advice, we're actually ready to do that, to help you out with that and mentor you.
So we can jump in here.
Yeah, let's do that.
The objective of the study.
Mike to talk about the annual report at something, but let's go ahead. Go ahead and do the objective.
So the objective of the study was to describe the snapshot of the educational infrastructure in the United States in 2018, so pre-COVID, which is actually a really important distinction here, because things might have changed. And the annual report it does change. There's some questions at the bottom that actually get altered depending on what it is that the COA is looking for in a particular year. But this is a standard process that all COA accredited programs do. And accreditation is required in many states in order for their students to
CAAHEP
graduate.
accredited.
I'm sorry, CAAHEP accreditation.
CAAHEP accredited. He's not a program director.
How long have you been doing this,
okay,
Dave?
all right.
Come on.
I just got
Step
voted off
aside.
the stage. Oh, geez. Total faux pas, total faux
Yes,
pas.
programs are accredited by the
By
Commission on
CAAHEP.
Accreditation of
Right,
Allied Health
right,
Educational
right.
Programs
Right.
under the recommendation and advice
Of the COA.
the COA.
Thank you
MSP.
for keeping me straight. Love it, love it, love it. So the methods here were to pull these resources. They're available from the COA. And again, the idea is there's a resource assessment matrix, and that gives you a summary of all the different parts of the program. There's incredible information here about what is the nature of paramedic education in the US. So maybe Mike can describe a little bit of that annual report and the rank.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So the annual report of progress is something that's existed for a number of years. The format, of course, over time has changed. The current format that we're using, even though we make some tweaks to it seemingly every year, largely to gather data that we hope to be able to share with programs and the EMS community more broadly about what programs are doing is really the goal of that. Another goal for the report is obviously we need to collect outcome information, right, on what programs are doing and how things are going in the interest of protection of the public as well as the students that are the customers in essence for these programs. And so the outcomes that are reported, the National Registry or state examination pass rates is one component. Retention of students in a program is another metric that is looked at. And then finally, positive placement. So that the graduate of a program is not just getting education, but is then actually able to take those knowledge, skills, and abilities and put them into practice by seeking gainful employment, volunteering for an EMS agency, or whatever they choose to do or pursue, and even continuing their education. We know that there are a handful of programs in the country that have students that ultimately are using their EMS education as a stepping stone to other things, whether or not that be med school, physician assistant programs. So students that are graduating but continuing their education in other endeavors is also considered positive placement. All of those outcomes really emanate from the Department of Education. And these are things that institutional accreditors require. It trickles down through the accreditor for CAAHEP, and then CAAHEP trickles that down to us. And our board of directors, which Megan is a member of our current board of directors, as a sponsor representative for the National Association of EMS Educators, we are looking at those outcomes on a regular, consistent basis, and we require programs to share that information with prospective students.
And that those questions that are at the bottom of the annual report, there's additional, you have your thresholds to report, and then you have the questions. As Dave said, those change. And this year we saw some changes that went alongside what kind of changes we might have made, what kind of impact we had due to COVID. So those are some great pieces of information. We can't wait to hear about those at some point.
Yeah, Megan, exactly right. So the annual report was due into us from, I want to say it was like 708 or 709 programs. It was just a tad over 700 programs that had annual reports that were due this year. They were due into our office on May 15th. So they're literally fairly fresh. We have not yet had a chance to crack into the data and look at that and kind of start to analyze those things. But the unique questions that we included in this particular report, knowing that it was a reporting year for 2020, we know that COVID certainly had monumental impacts on educational programs at the paramedic level. We wanted to try to gather data. Panchal from the National Registry is part of this project as well. But those questions were crafted by us to try to ascertain the true impact of what COVID did to our educational programs. And so we're really excited to try to get into that data, get into that information, and share what those impacts were with the broad EMS community.
Yeah, that's an important point too. Some people may be wondering, if you're not used to the annual report, why are the data 2 years old? And actually, it really helped us this year because it may have taken us longer to complete students. So now we had a chance to report on the 2020 year to see if our students had gone on to get jobs and have job placement. And I know one of the other things is, if you have questions about your annual report, like I did, I picked up the phone and called Mike and said, okay, let's talk about this data point. How do I report this accurately and keep the integrity of the report? So that's something that's always available as well. Let's dive into the actual study then, and so we know what they looked at. We know that what their objective was. Let's talk about what they used and what their usually some of these articles will have, and editorial limitations are what they are, but maybe a breakdown of the programs and how many they had to exclude in their data set. So they did have a data set that totaled, I believe it was 677 actual programs that had submitted data. 100% response rate, which of course you never see because it's a required thing. So even with the exclusions, and they had to exclude mostly for data entry issues, and the data entry issues had to do with numbers of hours of classroom time. Sometimes a person would enter a range, and so they made the decision that instead of using that, they would just remove those. And then the other aspect was, if they put an approximate, they just use the number, remove the approximate and use the number. So that'll be a limitation. It's an approximate, but it's in the, they still maintained 622, I think it was, or 26 programs, which is 93% of accredited programs. And if you think about 93% response rate, and you've done survey research, you know that that's an incredible response rate. So it looks like we may have, a really good data set for a representation of paramedic programs.
Yeah, and this was published in Prehospital Disaster Medicine, in case you want to pull it up on your own, if you're able to, if you have a library subscription, or can get at it. And I also found it interesting, out of 677 programs that are actually in this group of schools, only 626 had cohorts graduating in this period, which is sort of an interesting concept, that approximately 51 programs never graduated a student in that time period.
Yeah, and Dave, to comment on that, again, I was not part of this particular project, but I can take a guess as to why that might be. Keep in mind that we require programs that are just initially launching their existence. If they, for example, hold from CAAHEP a status of being a letter of review program, they may have just enrolled their first cohort of students. They're still required to submit an annual report, even though they may not have had any graduates yet. So they could actually be reporting zeros for those three outcomes that we were talking about earlier, and they would still be submitting a report, which would probably account for some of those 51 programs.
Love it.
And they did exclude those who reported zero. So that was, so you had to have at least one student, but that's still something to think about.
Yeah, and let's be honest, there are paramedic programs in this country who are not accredited, especially in states that don't require accreditation. New York, North Carolina, they can take a state exam. You're not necessarily going to be accredited. And so it isn't necessarily an end-all be-all. But frankly, with 17,422 paramedic students enrolled, this does really seem like a very representative sample. And for years, people have asked me, well, how many paramedic students get trained in the United States each year? And about the only statistic we had was how many people take the national registry, not necessarily how many people enroll. And so this is very helpful to get a sense of what the size of the animal is. That's what a descriptive study does. I also think, in terms of just discussing a little bit of the methods and what you'll hear in the results, is that in research, we look for, are these continuous variables or categorical variables? So in this case, the continuous variables are things like the number of students, the number of programs. These are just 0 to infinity, and each one of them has its own representation. But then there are subcategories that say, look, how many cohorts, how many, in which category, for example, of types of degrees did you get? Did you get a certificate? Did you get an associate's degree? Did you get a bachelor degree? And so we've struggled for a long time to know exactly how many programs are giving bachelor degrees. And here we have a beautiful study that will tell us just very descriptively in 2018, and drum roll please.
That's table
these
two.
are
He's
table
jumping
2.
ahead.
Oh, I'm jumping ahead. Sorry. No, I'm not
okay.
going to give it away. I'm not going to give it
That's
away.
okay. Keep going.
But
I have a hard time getting to the point sometimes, so
it's
keep me on task.
it's a
2%, I think, or 2, yeah.
Yeah, 2% are actually bachelor degrees, and the majority, as you would imagine, are certificates. So it's 566 are giving certificates. 343 are associate degrees, which is 55 of them, and 15, so 2% are actually giving the, so 55% associate degree. So about half of the paramedic students in this pile get an associate's degree or in programs that grant associate degrees.
Yeah,
So,
one other point to make about that data, Dave, that I think is a limitation of the project, right, is that there are a number of programs that may have a student that is enrolled on a certificate of completion basis or a diploma that already possesses an associate's degree or already possesses a bachelor's degree and maybe even a master's degree. I know that was the case in my own program. And so I think if you just look at these numbers, it would underrepresent the overall educational attainment of some of the people that are becoming paramedics.
Love it. And we would call that an in-field degree. And I thought that it was really helpful too, in terms of the number of hours for these programs. So we've struggled for a long time. It's a chicken and egg thing. We had a 1,200 hour curriculum. Was it that people just adapted a 1,200 curriculum and that's where it stood? And here we're going to get a chance to actually see the number, and total hour of instructions are 1175 median, which we'll talk about median and mode and IQR and et cetera, interquartile ranges. But really the range is a tight range, I think, in terms of the interquartile range. Most of the programs are between 1,069 and 1,300 hours. And so that to me is a very strong indication that we're still floating around 1,200 hours for paramedic education. And then the corollary to that was to look at how much time is spent in the hospital and how much time is spent in the ambulance. And so if you combine, so 219 hours and pretty tight ranges. There's, interquartile ranges give us kind of the quarters of where the majority of these students are, and 168 to 272. So it is wide, but it's not hugely. It could have been wider, I think. And then the other thing is 160 hours of field experience and 180 in the capstone event, which really actually is sort of an interesting finding if you think that the concept of capstone is supposed to be the majority of those patient contacts. There's a significant field experience that's still very present, right? And in that range, 90 to 240, 100 to 250 in terms of the capstone, but that's about 340. And that is consistent with previously published work. So, that helps us validate that this is not, even though that's self-reported data, which is a limitation, and they pointed out, it's also there in some ways guesses on the part of program directors who may not track it as close as they could, or sort of have, maybe a student that they forgot about, or a student that zeroes out and then doesn't have the data, and it could, there's no validation process for this, and that is a major limitation of the study.
Yeah, and Dave, just to comment on that, in talking with some folks here at Accreditcon in Louisville this year, some of them have specifically asked the question, how do we report some of these hours? Some of the programs are very focused on competency outcomes, and so they're really not tracking hours. They're really looking at whether or not the person is attaining all of the established student minimum competencies that they're establishing for successful completion of the program.
That's good to hear. Let's go back for just 1 second to table 1. I wanted to ask you about cohort size.
Right.
So
right.
yeah, and this gets to your question about median versus mean. So if you looked at cohort size and you just took the 17,422 and you divided it by the 626 programs and you just looked at that, you'd get 28 students on average. But that's not a true representation of the data. And so the researchers decided to use the median. So which helps us with these extremes, when you have data that are at the extreme ends. And in this case, what we're seeing, it looks like, if you see these, they created categories to see what the frequency of, small cohort size versus large, how often do you have cohort sizes that are a certain, amount. The median came up to be 18. 18.
Yeah, 18. And really 12 to 30 is that interquartile range. So there is a wide variation, but it's sort of within what I would expect. Like there's not a lot of paramedic programs that have more than 30 students in a class. And there's not a lot of programs that have, less than 25% of them have cohorts that are less than 12. So that intuitively makes sense to me. What I was a little bit surprised about is just that there's a significant number, 53 or 8%, that have more than 4 cohorts a year. So there's programs that are very, very large, and the majority, 37% only do 1 cohort, but when you account for 2 cohorts, you're up to about 60% of the programs will do 1 or 2 cohorts.
I wonder if those are satellite programs?
Yeah, great point, Megan. I was going to say the same thing. Actually, in this particular data set, we were not asking programs to extrapolate out whether or not they had satellite locations that were being programs that were being offered at other campuses or other locations that might be 60, 100, 200 miles down the road. That is now something in this most recent annual report that we recognize as a shortcoming and was probably important data for us to collect. So now there is a specific portion in the report that actually asks for programs to separately or distinctly call out if they're reporting a satellite cohort. So hopefully we'll be able to gather some additional data and information from that. I will tell you, just in my role, I spent a lot of time working with programs that are adding satellites or another designation that we have, an alternate location. Not to get into the details of that, but we are seeing existing programs that are frequently now adding more and more alternate locations and satellite locations to try to innovatively and strategically meet the educational needs of students where they're at. There can be a challenge for some of them to travel for an hour one way, a couple of hours, in order to get to a paramedic education program. And so I see programs adapting and being more readily willing to provide those opportunities for students where they're at.
That's great. And you'll notice that there is some information on satellites here, but it's really about the numbers of satellites and then the region. So they have organized programs by NASEMSO region, so you can see where the concentration of programs is.
Right, and the South will rule again.
Yes.
They will ride again. The South is definitely clear. 38% of the programs are really in the South. And then you see, about 22% split into Great Lakes and the Eastern region. So I was, I sort of expected that, but I thought it's just good to really kind of, and that's what research does, right? It confirms your gut. By the way, you can ask questions. We have the questions and chat area live and up and running. So please feel free. We would love for you to actually interact with us live. So, in terms of results, the exam pass rates were really interesting to me. 74%. Now the 70-70, explain the 70-70-70-70 rule. What is all that about?
Oh, the thresholds.
The thresholds, yeah. Right? So what's that all about?
Yeah, so as it pertains to the thresholds for the 3 outcomes, Dave, that we were looking at before, the annual report starts off with programs recording their enrollment, right, for a cohort of students. And we ultimately are looking at how many of the students they retained. Retention and attrition are, opposite sides of the same coin. We're looking at how many students enrolled ultimately completed their education. Now, for the first time in the current 2020 annual report that was just submitted, the board of directors for CAAHEP really wanted to level the playing field, if you will. We had a lot of disparate information that was being reported by programs. Some utilized a college established add drop date, for example. Others were using a 25% rule. If the student had gotten, through 25% of the program, that's when they actually started to count them as an actual student. Some programs were using, if you walk in the door and you sit down for orientation and you come back to the next class session, you count. So we actually made a decision, the board of directors made a decision that we were going to level the playing field and define that. And we settled on 10% of the total clock hours that a program has in looking at those total clock hours. So if the average program is 1,200 hours as an example, once that student for any of the core paramedic educational content gets to 120 hours, they now become a student that has to be reported out in the retention attrition table. The 70% and where that comes from, you'll note that we're looking at a threshold for programs to retain a minimum of 70% of their students that enroll. We're looking for 70% of the students that graduate from the program that go on to take the national registry examination, 70% of those people to pass that test. Likewise, when somebody successfully then passes the test, we're looking for 70% of those students to actually, or graduates at that point, to actually become employed or positively placed. Now, there's some nuances in that. Of course, some people don't take the examination. They don't ever intend to work as a paramedic because they're going to medical school and they've been enrolled there. So that has to be accounted for. But the 70% thresholds have been established by the CAAHEP Board of Directors. We have looked at that. There are a little over 30 programs that fall under the CAAHEP umbrella as far as allied health. They're an incredibly large accreditor. They actually have all different kinds of allied health programs that fall under there. And it's very common. We looked at what other programs are requiring for outcomes thresholds, and it's very common to see 70%. So that's where those numbers have come from.
What do you say to small programs? Because if you look at this chart, we can see we have a concentration of small programs. What do you say when a small program says, gosh, if I lose 2 people, I'm hitting the threshold?
Yeah, exactly, Megan. So you know what? Programs need to do the best job that they can do. And sometimes there are things that they can do, and sometimes there are things that are beyond their control. What I would tell you is, again, keep in mind, we are not looking at 1 year in deciding to take an accreditation action for any of the outcomes reporting that a program has, even if they're falling below a 70% threshold. We do report that to them. We do have a responsibility to communicate with them and their leadership at the college or the program, wherever it happens to be, to say, hey, we just want to note that we're looking for you to examine this. What can you reflectively look at and think about to potentially improve your performance in these areas? But we also understand that some of those things are beyond their control. When we start to look at those outcomes, we're going to look at 3 years of aggregate information, understanding that there are going to be peaks and valleys for programs. COVID is a situation that we know had significant influence on programs and their performance to no fault of their own. We don't yet know, the 2020 report will probably reveal some of that to us, but we don't really understand completely or fully, other than anecdotally, what the impact of COVID was on the educational processes for paramedics throughout the country. So that's where those numbers came from. But Megan, one other point that I would make to the small programs, the key here is to keep documentation, right? Maintain evidence of what you are doing as a program to enable students to have the best chance of success. Retention is really the item that I think programs have the biggest challenge with, and that they're always a little bit uneasy about. Keep good documentation about why students are leaving your program, and then look at your program reflectively to determine, do we have a robust orientation process that really lets the students know what they're getting themselves into? Do we have support systems in place to identify students early on that might be at risk, that would benefit from a tutor or other support services that might be able to be brought to bear to help them? Those are the things that we're going to ask the questions about. If those things are in place, keep looking at it, keep working hard, but we understand that if you have a small cohort, the loss of 1 or 2 students could already have you in that under 70% threshold.
Yeah, and even for a middle-sized program, sometimes your students will get hired out of your program to take a job that, maybe to go to fire service or go somewhere else because they've landed the job. They're already EMTs, so they've landed something that will pay them better. And that's something, again, keep the conversation going, keep the, the discussion going. You can't do anything if we don't talk about it.
So for the paper, 74% actually hit that first attempt pass rate. So 74% for pass on first attempt is the number. And I sometimes wonder when we set benchmarks and people meet them really, really closely, if sort of the answer is what you were hoping for, right?
Yeah.
So if you say, well, do 50 team leads and suddenly the average is 50 team leads, how many could they do? Maybe they could do more, but at least they're doing that. So this actually, that number kind of drew my attention. And the other one is 89% after 3 attempts, which means that there's 11% of those graduates who are after 3 attempts not passing national registry. And that was a concern of mine. I thought, going through paramedic school is not an inexpensive thing. We can get to the numbers of what it costs to actually run or how well-funded programs are here in a second. But it's a number that could draw us to actually take action on some of those aspects and improve our pass rates. Let's talk about this funding piece. The budgets are, for the most part, 34% of these, so 213 programs reported under $100,000 budget. And then under 500,000, that's the majority. So 70–80% of the programs are functioning in a budget that's under 200,000. And it struck me when we were talking before this webinar, just to plan it, you said the average cost per student in higher ed is?
Well, the per pupil spending is what I was looking at. And if you take the amount, if you just take the 100,000 and you divide it by the average number of students, then it comes out to 7,000 per pupil spending for paramedic
for this
programs.
Paramedic program, yeah.
In colleges, if you look it up, it's 20,000, 25,000 per pupil spending, and that's college. So you could be a history major,
right?
You could be,
which doesn't require a lot of equipment, and I might
add,
add,
lab instruction,
and arguably graduates are not going to make life or death decisions and actually.
No offense to history.
No offense to the history buffs, right? Okay, so we're doing more with less, and maybe to a point of unsustainability. Like maybe we can't do this much with this little, and what does that say?
Yeah, and Dave, that's something that we hear commonly, right? That programs may be under-resourced. And I know that part of this paper looked at the resource assessment survey process and then the resource assessment matrix to look at the adequacy of resources for programs. I would point out that I do think there's some limitations in how the monetary situation is reported. There could be programs that are rolled up under a larger budget and they have difficulty potentially extrapolating that out, just working as an administrator in higher education. The other component that could be involved is there could be all different kinds of grants or other types of free funding that are coming into programs to purchase equipment that may not be readily reported in some of the data that was submitted for this particular project.
I was thinking that. I was thinking it would be great to have a budget worksheet so that we could level that. How much do you get from Perkins money each year? Do you have other sources of funding for equipment supplies? Donations from, companies.
And maybe you have a ton of residents that are assigned to be able to teach in your program, and it doesn't cost you anything. So it doesn't show up in the budget, but you have a ton of extra staff.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
So as our time always gets short in this, I do want to get to that resource assessment matrix because fully, 78% really did meet minimum thresholds, but 22%, so 140 programs did not meet the recommended resource assessment matrix threshold. So that's a quarter of the programs, and the authors point that out in the discussion. So
also, I spoke with Dr. Panchal at a break here, and we talked about some data that he had actually published and presented. It's actually in an abstract at NAEMSP this past January, and he broke it down and showed me that, in the top 5, 2 of the top 5 had to do with physician interaction and medical direction, which I don't think would be surprising to a lot of program directors, and others had to do with financial and facilities. So
and internships.
And
internships made it
yeah.
to number 8. Okay,
Yeah.
just number 8.
Yeah, so just a little bit of more background on that. There are 10 different components to the resource assessment survey. And where is this information coming from? I think is important for the audience to understand it if they're not cued into this part of it. There's a survey that is intended to be given to students that are currently enrolled but near the conclusion of their education. And then there's a separate survey that goes to personnel. This would be anybody that, the faculty, instructors, anybody that's touching the program and the students.
The advisory committee too.
And the advisory committee.
Which is critical because that's employers.
The advisory committee is included in that survey as well. So the information is looked at from a student perspective as well as a personnel perspective. And then you look at that and you try to draw some conclusions from it. And there are certainly discrete aspects of each of those component areas, from facilities to equipment to faculty, medical director, medical interaction, a whole host of things that are looked at there, right? So it's intended to be a reflective process, a QI process for the program to reflect on their resources. And they need to do this survey once a year, annually. It's required for them to do in the standards to help them identify where their opportunities for improvement are, as well as identify their strengths.
That's important to know because the RAM is not collected for research purposes. It's a great tool. It's another data set, but it's actually for program directors to do things like short and long-term planning, strategic planning. I mean, it's great. Every year you present it at your advisory committee meeting. You break it up into your student results and your personnel results. Of course, the limitation there is your response rates. So you work on a way to get a really good response rate, and it can be a very powerful tool for improving funding and improving the program itself when you get this feedback right from the people who are your users.
And accreditation is really, correct me if I'm wrong, but our mission is to protect the student. So we want to make sure these programs are doing right by the students. It's also to improve education and in general, paramedic education in the country. And so you do see, I think this is a great beginning. In the discussion, they point out it was meant, this entire process is meant for improvement. And beginning to describe a bit of the animal, I think is really helpful. I do think their limitation section was rather thin. I know these authors, and so I say that with all love and respect, because there's nothing here about attrition, which is in the annual report. And so at least tell us why you didn't put it into the paper, because if you took out key pieces, maybe you're intending to analyze them and publish them in another paper, but at least we're left with, did you, it creates a doubt, which of these data did you pick out and why these and not the others? Mm-hmm. And just telling us that some of it dropped off because it was poorly completed or it wasn't, there wasn't enough of it. That is enough for us to have a little bit of transparency. But I was disappointed that we only have enrolled, we don't have the graduated number. And we need to know about the attrition in order to really get a sense for what is everybody else doing. It'd be a good number to share.
Yeah, Dave, great point. And again, I was not specifically involved with this particular project, so I'm not sure why that didn't make it into the paper in some manner. I will tell you that there is a project that is currently underway, and it is actually to the stage of authorship right now in talking with Dr. Panchal from the National Registry, where we are specifically extrapolating information solely to write a paper and report out on the aspects of retention and attrition for paramedic education programs. So stay tuned, because I think here by the end of the year, it will probably be out for publication.
And we try and invite authors to the podcast, so or webinars. So we did invite these authors. Unfortunately, all of them had conflicting appointments and interests at this point, so we couldn't get them here. We will, and we will follow up because all of them are friends of the PCRF and have come on our webinars in the past. So nothing personal. It was all unfortunate, but we still think this is great work. It needed to be done.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, I think just in conclusion for me, to wrap it up, I feel like, yay, we've finally seen, you know, some of these data, and you know, when you go back to the Margolis study, which they do mention
They do.
of high performing
Yeah.
paramedic programs, it takes us back to what kind of faculty do they have? Do they have a good ratio? The fact that there's only 2 full-time faculty, actually in the results here, the average is 2 employees, two full-time faculty. That's a, you know, one of those, high performing paramedic programs have more resources, and you know, all these little tiny pieces add up, like cardiac arrest. It's not one silver bullet. It's a whole lot of stuff that makes this complex web work. So, you know,
It's important to use this data to drive improvement. And I think that's a real key here. And I think when it comes to other, you know, smaller pieces of data, this was a snapshot. So it gives us an overview, and now we can dig into the weeds and into the deeper aspects of it. But I do think that it's a real powerful thing to be able to take to your administrator or to your advisory committee and drive improvement in your program.
Yeah, and for us as well, Megan, I think it's important for us to trend this data over time, right? To see what types of changes are being made by programs that ultimately pay dividends to them in the end and make improvements for paramedic education. The other quick comment just to make, I will let folks know, you know, while we start to digest the 2020 annual report information, we will certainly be looking forward to sharing information about the impact that COVID had on paramedic programs during that time. The other thing I would tell people to stay tuned to, I know just in the short time I've been the associate director for COA EMSP, is that there are a couple of research projects that are underway with people that are working on dissertations in our profession.
Yes.
So we have a policy and a process that if you are doing scholarship that has the ability to benefit and better inform our profession, we welcome those researchers to reach out to us in order to gain access to some of this data if that's something that's of interest to them.
Yeah, and we just interviewed one, you know, we talked about that earlier, and I'm not sure if it was part of a doctorate work or if it was just in general, but he was a dean, or he is a dean right now and was a program director. The last thing I wanted to point out on this table, though, is the simulation, not just because the fabulous Dennis Edgerly is going to be presenting.
Simulation right next door in the next hour. Not streamed live.
And who's sitting right over here that you can't see, but the famous Kim McKenna, who is the author of the Super Study, which was also mentioned in this paper.
Love it.
But notice the simulation, how prepared we are, at least physically, to run simulation. And I would argue we are, because as Dennis is going to point out, we're going to point out, yes, it was.
Yeah. Now, whether they're in the closet or actually being used, the mannequins need to come out of the closet. That's the thing.
And on the floor, not in a bed.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about this. It doesn't necessarily, fidelity, it means reality, a level of realism, not fancy schmancy expensive things, right?
Of course.
Right. And all you have to do is talk to Dennis. He can tell you how to get everything for free. So
during this entire conference, Dennis Edgerly has become the expert on many things. And so I think he is. So if you can find him, absolutely. You know, he will rent hotel rooms in strip malls, like these, you know, by the hour hotels to have simulations with the students. And, you know, scene safety is no longer like a theory. It's like a real, like, what's going on in the room next door?
Yeah, the Essex Motel, I believe Pat said it was. But if you look, 93% at the intermediate level, 84% at the advanced mannequin level, that's in 2018. And everyone, of course, has the simple and the task trainers, which are expensive in themselves, I would say, especially for the return sometimes on those task trainers. So that was a pleasant surprise. And then we have 11% with virtual reality in 2018. I was surprised at that. So long way since the Super Study, huh, Kim? She's sitting over here.
And I think that will only grow.
Yeah. Oh, I think so too. Especially with COVID, and that was pre-COVID. Right. So think about how much things have come along since COVID. Okay. Any final comments?
I think we've pretty much covered
Exhausted.
it all.
We want to get,
We're going to get back. Actually, we're going to try and get lunch before you
Yeah.
talk, but then
We'll grab Megan a plate.
please tune in to the PCRF webinars. One of the reasons we created this booth with again, the generous help of Limmer Education, particularly Stephanie has been running around helping us with a million things, is that we really think that education programs can use these podcasts to infuse evidence-based practices in their classrooms. And also the clinical podcast can become a way to meet the curricular requirements of the research module for paramedic education. So I would encourage you, we would encourage you to have them read the article that's being discussed, let them watch the webinar, and then have a classroom discussion about what it is that they just read as a way of engaging in evidence-based practice when it comes to each one of your topics. So don't just let it be a one-time thing when you're discussing what spinal motion restriction or the use of ketamine or any number of other interesting topics that are on fire right now for research. Maybe just, having them, again, use these webinars. We're archiving them in YouTube. And thanks to Limmer, we're going to be able to offer them historically. So these are great ways to engage. And thank you, Randy, for tuning in, and all of you who are online. That's really special to be able to kind of be live with you out there and everybody over here. So great to have you.
and thank you, Mike Miller. We actually got to steal you for this long. I thought for sure you were going to get pulled
It's my
away.
pleasure. Thank you for
so
the
much.
opportunity to join you. It's been great.
Just one addition to what Dave was saying too, if you're a program director, remember you can use these podcasts or webinars on the Education Research Journal Club as a discussion among your faculty at faculty meetings to talk about evidence-based education and improving the pedagogy in our classrooms as we teach our students. So thank you all so much. We hope to see you
Megan.
on Friday, June 24th, 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, back for our usual Research Journal Club. I'm gonna go back and look and find a good article for you. If you have an idea, send it to me or to Dave Page, and we will see you then or before then at the Clinical Journal Club on Monday, June 13th. I think that says it's kind of covered.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all for now. Bye-bye.
We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at www.pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF at UCLA and on our website at www.prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsor, Limmer Education, providing education tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey.